To my right is Torben Kling Petersen, PhD, Principal Solution Architect, HPC Solution Xyratex. Torben Kling Petersen has worked with high-performance computing in one form or another since 1994, and over the years both at Sun and subsequently at Oracle. He's worked in a number of capacities, such as lead architect for enterprise data center. That's enough. And that's enough. Ladies and gentlemen, Torben Kling Petersen, PhD.
Thank you very much. Somehow you always need to twinge it at the end, but that's okay. So I actually wanted to do a slightly different talk this year, and the main reason for that is that this is the Lustre user community. Now, according to my count, looking through the list of attendees, there are 5 users from Europe in this audience. 5. Well, we could get 7 if we add Aurelian and Stefan to it, but these are hardcore developers, so I don't actually call them a user. They are much more than users, so they don't count, unfortunately. So we got 5 users in this audience. Now, since I'm in the European time zone, I kind of focus on that to most of my extent. So I've been doing a lot of customer visits over the last 12 months. I've reviewed a lot of RFPs over the last 12 months. I talked to a lot of customers, etc., and came up with some fairly interesting, maybe not scientifically defined statistics, but statistics nonetheless about what the European community looks like and the community as such. Now, there is a community organization in Europe, i.e. the EUFS, but they are kind of doing their own work. I'm more talking about the user community. Now, there are small user groups in the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, and some other things, and a lot of users talk to each other. But for most of these users, the situation seems to be a little bit less obvious, I would say, than some of the big users in the States. So if we look at Europe as such, or EMEA, I came to account of at least 120 systems in production. I'm not talking about test system, I'm not talking about things having in the lab, systems in production in Europe. And that's probably a low number. Again, we got 120 customers in Europe running it at least, and we have only 4 customers represented in this room. And I think that's a little bit sad. And I think that one of the reasons for that is, and this, I've heard this a long time, or several times I've talked to the European customers, is that LUG is just developers talking developer stuff. In that case, we need to change the title if that is what it's intended to be, because I see very few end users talking about what they're doing, talking about their problems. It used to be a lot more, but it is not. So I kind of taken upon myself to be their voice today about some of the issues they have, some of the projects they want to do, and where they want to go with that. So, as I said, a lot of these systems exist. A lot is academic. Most is fairly small ones. We still see a lot in the 100 terabyte range, even smaller. Most of them are running still 1.8. We heard that from other speakers. I even know of a handful that still run 1.6. And I'm fairly happy with it, but we all know the problem with that. Most are home-built and self-supported. We also heard that before. Not everybody have a support contract, mainly because it's actually difficult getting it, specifically when you're running on a home-built system that isn't integrated by one of the big guys out there. But the problem here is the fact that a lot of these are finally getting to the next stage where they need to go into RFP requirements. And some of these requirements seem to differ a lot from what I see coming out of the US and the rest of the world. But the one thing I really want to bring up, and it was mentioned about earlier, GPFS is still out there. They're still a very big competitor. We know we got an edge on them, but let's not forget that IBM has a marketing and a business machine that's really hard to beat. So, one of the things I wanted to mention is some of the requirements that seem to be changing. Everybody seems to be mostly focused about scalability and performance, but we're starting to see other things going as well. HPC or performance is not unimportant, but we've heard about small files. Small files is becoming an increasingly bigger problem. We're talking about reliability and supportability of these things. It's hard to maintain a Lustre file system. Backup, or I should say the lack of backup, is becoming a very big problem as well for many of these customers, and it has to be addressed. Desktop connectivity, we heard about with stripping out the, I had a legacy support for Windows, Mac OS, etc., which we know actually doesn't work anymore because that's a full system, but it's still required by some of these customers. Energy efficiency, that's a thing that most people seem to forget about here. Statistics reporting, etc., and in the end, capacity in the end. Now, I will focus on each of these, just give you some of this feedback I've been getting over the last year. So first of all, for small files, it's becoming an increasing problem. We see a significant part of the file system I've had a chance to touch, having up to about 50% of all files being smaller than 256K, which is not really what Lustre was intended to do originally. But that's unfortunately the reality of the application we see today. We know that SSD can help, but Lustre is not really conducive to using SSDs in the best possible way, and there's some other problems in the system with the different protocols as well that doesn't really enable us to do this well over the wire. So anything we do in this area, and there have already been suggestions here, anything we do needs to be actually done fairly soon, and it needs to be tightly integrated, because having an add-on or a specific path to those SSD-based or NVRAM-based solutions just don't work. It has to be unobtrusive. Reliability. Well, we've heard all about data integrity problems over the years. I don't know if you've followed the largest or the fastest, I should say, GPFS file system, which is at LRZ in Germany. That system has now been down 4 times this year alone. Each time it's been down not because a component gone down, but because of data corruption. Now, that's something that worries a lot of the users, data corruption. So T10diff has been brought up several times. It needs to be integrated. We have the Lawrence Livermore people doing ZFS, but CSF is not for everybody. So we need to come up with something that actually works as part of the Lustre packaging. Hardware resiliency. The fact that we have a lot of system out there that's actually non-redundant. Even in big production, they have non-redundant system, which is an issue, because we need to get that fixed. And the fact that people are starting asking for self-healing software. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but self-healing software seems to be something that everybody wants. So we got to fix that too. Manageability. It's already been mentioned, and I say it again, managing a Lustre file system is not that easy. It's actually fairly hard for a lot of people because there is not a lot of training to be had on advanced feature, debugging, troubleshooting, etc. There is the basic training that's being offered by Intel, but it only scratches the surface on all these different things that happens. We still have the problem of the fact that log files and error files from Lustre is hard to understand unless you're Andreas. Most of us can't really figure them out. All of these things need to be done. Security, not just the standard security, but Kerberos has been mentioned. Kerberos is being used a lot, specifically in Europe, because many universities realize that they cannot have a file system at all. So they share. That means long-distance access to the system. That means security over the wire. And as also been mentioned, Lustre is no longer just for Scratch. It's increasingly being used as your site-wide file system that's scalable because it's a single namespace for Scratch, for project, for home, or whatever. So these kind of things is something that is more and more often part of RFPs as a requirement to be able to support these features. Backing up. Well, backing up is really becoming a big issue. There is ways of doing it with data movers and manual movements of files to a secondary file system, which we all do. Unfortunately, it's not a very smooth process. HSM is the really big thing here. And I'm really sad to see that it slipped out of 2.4. And from my point of view, it's a much, much more important feature than some of the other ones who unfortunately moved in and replaced HSM as part of 2.4. And I think that's a big mistake from this community that we didn't push to HSM more. Replication of file system. Again, this has been mentioned. We have requirements in RFPs for being able to do disaster recovery of file system, being able to copy an entire file system. Not necessarily snapshots, even though that's being used as well, but being able to do that. It's just that the size of these file systems makes this really hard, so we need to come up with something that's really parallel and really scales with the file system. Desktop connectivity. Well, most of us who have had this solution has always been roll your own. You kind of set up a Samba server that works. It's not a big deal. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale very well. It's really hard to support, and it also makes a case for being an add-on and not something that's integrated. If we look at some of the new customers being using that, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's digital content creation, as we heard from the WorkMech guys, whether it's genomics that has a sampler still running on Windows, etc., financial institutions with all of their tools based on Windows platform, the workflows now require this to be an unobtrusive part of the solution. And since we probably will not see a Windows native client in a long time, neither a Mac client in a long time, the only way is using through some kind of gateway function. And that needs to be integrated into our solution as an integrated part, not just from an installation and management, but also from a long-time monitoring and maintenance point of view. So I think that's another really important comment from many of these users. Energy efficiency. Well, not everybody has Tennessee Power that delivers unlimited power for no money at all. So some of these in Europe, especially with the fact that there are requirements from the EU, then any new data center that does not have EU approval will be capped at 2 megawatts. Now, 2 megawatts sounds like a lot of power, but when you consider it from an end-to-end point, 2 megawatts in today's exascale environments is not a lot. And since storage is becoming bigger and bigger, energy efficiency in storage is really, really required. So we will start seeing these new metrics coming up: watts per gigabytes per second, watts per terabyte of usage, etc. So all of these things need to be taken care of. And the problem is, it's been a part of the compute environment for a long time, but it hasn't really been part of the Lustre environment and storage as such. I think that's important. So we even have conferences in Europe. Now, I haven't actually seen a US conference on energy-aware storage, but we've had conference in Europe for a couple of years now that actually does energy-efficient focus on compute and storage, which I think is kind of an interesting point to look at. With that also means that our tool needs now to start reporting power consumption, and needs to be accurate power consumption, not just an estimate. And apologizes for the plug on our user interface, but the software that we deliver with our system has this functionality built in. It actually shows real-time usage of power in a statistical way. Obviously, we use Ganglia to visualize it, but we also calculate that on the main tab so you can see your current total power usage of your storage environment. And that's something that a lot of customers are asking for. I think that's really important from a monitoring point of view. Now, none of this has anything to do with DNS or 1 terabyte per second or anything like that. But we also have to remember that these are customers that's going to the next stage. Statistics, being able to actually report what your file system has been doing over the last couple of months, years. Who's been using what? How much have been used? I/O behavior. Actually identifying that user who thought he knew how to tweak the parameters of striping, etc., and suddenly trashing the file system because he's doing something that is not quite ready to do. Identifying those in a quick manner is really important. Tools to follow a job, not just through the compute, but all the way down to storage, in a similar way to what Vampire Trace is doing with the thread libraries and systems. Being able to actually monitor it from the time the user submitted to the resource manager until those data have been put on the disk drive. And being able to follow that through is really, really a common requirement. And it's something that we're still struggling a bit to do. And we also have the problem of capacity planning, because a lot of these systems are now getting to a point where, similar to the recent RFP we saw from TAC, where the capacity will actually outstripping performance requirements. That's not common. Most often it's the other way around, but we're starting to see that. And that's something that becomes interesting when you start looking at scalability over time, because not everybody wants to buy that megalomatic system from day one. They actually want to buy a system and then in a nice way be able to increase capacity as needed. And we see that as well as part of these things. So in summary, my feeling is that European customers, mainly because they tend to be smaller than many of the US ones, focus a lot on enterprise features. They want more manageability. They want more overview of systems. But a lot of them I talk to, and the reason why I think many of them aren't here, is because they feel they cannot affect the roadmap. And that's kind of sad that a lot of them feel that they have no influence on the roadmap. Because if we are only catering to the 5 or 10 largest systems in the world, Lustre doesn't really have a good future, I think. We need to get this to a wider adoption. We need to get it into industry. We need to get it to a place where we can actually find people who are willing to pay for it. Because some of our largest customers kind of get it for free almost. The other thing which is important is the enterprise features of reliability. Yes, we all think that's important, but these customers are paranoid about it. You talk to CERN about the fact that they did an analysis of 50 million files, and they found 200 files with corruption in it. You might think that is not important for 50 million files, that 200 files have corruption. But if those 200 files were the one who would generate the next Nobel Prize, it is important. Now, that's also one of the reasons why these guys are not doing Lustre, because they don't trust it. And we need to show them that we can do that. Small file I/O replication, etc. I already mentioned that. Now, GPFS did generate a lot of business when Oracle kind of downtoned what happened with Lustre and didn't develop it. Now, we're at a time where a lot of these vendors are now seeing that IBM is changing the licensing fee. They're changing the way they support these things. They're changing their availability to support, etc. And are willing to start to replace it with a Lustre file system. But unless we can offer them something which is fairly close in feature set to GPFS, but still maintain the advantage of having performance, having scalability, having low latency and all these things. Unless we can add these other features, it doesn't matter for these guys. They're going to continue using GPFS. And as I said, Lustre is being seen as the only viable choice to GPFS today. However, unless we start talking to these customers and make their voices heard in the general community, I think we have a problem. And with that, I'm done, actually.
Wow. Right on.
I got a question. So what do we do to get the European members more actively involved? We've done everything we can. All of our working groups are open. They're open reflectors. We've had meetings scheduled in the mornings to try to encourage more of them to be able to attend. What else can we do to make them participate more in what we're doing here?
So the one thing I was thinking about, which was mentioned earlier as one of the OpenSFS initiatives, is a marketing model. We need to actually market this community more, make these people feel that it's easier to reach out than just talking to us from Xyratex or the people from Intel or whoever visit them in a commercial capacity. Now, they still appreciate being brought up to date on what the community is doing, but there may be better ways of reaching out to these things. I would suggest that we have LUG in the US, we have LAD in Europe. Both of these focus to a large degree on developers. I think that it might be a good idea to start looking at doing smaller events, which is entirely end-user focused, not developer-focused. Exactly what that form should be, I don't know, but I think that we need to start reaching out more than we've done.
I think it's important that you promote Lustre, because right now, okay, we are all set together, but let's bring others and listen. I think it's a very important point. You know how to do it, and support it.
I'll let somebody else figure out how to do it. I just complain.
Yeah, Torben. So it's Andreas right here.
Oh, there. Sorry.
So I mean, Lustre is open source software, and there's no reason that the European users and developers, and a lot of them, if you're saying they're academic sites, they must have grad students and people who can develop Lustre, and those features. The reason those features get developed is because, well, yes, the big labs, are interested in more funding to do that, and so it incents, us as developers to work on those features. But if they have requirements, they can develop those features without spending a lot of money, right? If they have some grad students, they have a research group, you know, on storage or whatever, and they develop those features. I would be thrilled to see all of those things done, but there's not, you know, how do you get those features developed if there's nobody who's willing to work on them, right? Or to fund other people to work on them.
I hear you, but I think it's also kind of the chicken and hen problem here a little bit, because a lot of these people, or a lot of these sites could probably develop some of these tools, but they kind of need a little kick or help from the community to get started. So, you know, again, if we do an outreach program trying to reach more people and actually encourage that kind of communications and make sure that we provide better guidance for how to actually get their voice heard or their features developed, that might help. I honestly don't know how to do it. As I said, I've just collected features that I think this community should hear, that I hear from the customer.
I think their voice would be heard if they, you know, speak with
Torben?
code or whatever.
So, are we going to reset with Hugo still this week? Do you expect so? So Thursday morning. I think this is a point to bring up with Hugo and how to work with because one thing that I've discovered over the last year or so working with the European Commission and community and how they go about funding, it's entirely different than the North Americans. And they are developing features, they are getting funding, but we don't work in that mechanism. Is there a possibility that we could all benefit in the Lustre community on this? I absolutely believe there is. But we're going to have to work in their system, have to submit into their projects. We're going to have to do it that way. That's different from everything that we've been doing here in North America with like OpenSFS. So I would like follow up on this with Hugo, because I think Hugo could probably give us some insights like how to do that, because I think we should. There's actually a considerable amount of money, even with the problems in the economy. They're pouring it in, and they're specifically looking at I/O in their next round of funding.
Cool. All right. It's 3 o'clock. It's time for coffee. Once again, Torben Kling Petersen, PhD.